Reece was born on February 16, 1926. He joined the service in July 1944, a month after he graduated from high school. He was assigned to Fort Sheridan and then after to Camp Roberts for basic training. He traveled to Fort Dix, where he boarded the USS Aquitania and traveled 6 days to Scotland. He was assigned to General Patton's 3rd Army, 90th Division, where he served as a replacement soldier and an infantry rifleman.
The letters said to all of the young boys, they're 18, your friends and neighbors have selected you for military service. There was no backing out of that. The draft was on, so anybody, Walter used to say, who was warm, who had to go. Yeah. He was a sharpshooter rifleman, so he was always in front. He said no one was in front of us except the Germans and my sergeant. They had very little patience with young men who had not been with them. They were men already, not boys any longer. They had a very serious outlook about their education and very little tolerance for the goofiness of some of the 17 and 18-year-old boys that came to class. They had trained together with tanks. They were part of, they had a tank battalion associated with them. So as fast as the tanks could go, that's how fast they had to walk. General Patton was known for that, his fast movement.
Walter saw General Patton on one occasion.
He saw him once drive up in a Jeep during the Bulge, the Battle of the Bulge. And he had pearl-handled revolvers on. And he just waved and said hello to the men, and the Jeep went right back down the hill. That's the only time he ever saw him, but he knew he was a good commander.
Walter's first battle was at Metz, France, and it had a very special importance to him.
It became winter by the time he got there, and his first battle was at Metz, France, which the Germans had already taken twice, and his 359th Infantry Regiment, along with the other 2 regiments that made up the 90th Division, took Metz back. It became very special to him because his father had served in the very same village in World War I.
Following the battle at Metz, France, Walter found himself in the Battle of the Bulge.
He does say that he got to the Ardennes forest late in November. That was the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans surprised the hell out of us coming through the Ardennes in the middle of winter. It was the worst winter of my life. I was always cold, wet, dirty, hungry, living in foxholes in the coldest winter in Europe in 100 years.
At the Battle of the Bulge, the American Army was far less equipped compared to the Germans.
They didn't have adequate equipment. They didn't have the camouflage snow suits that the Germans were wearing. So once he and another soldier were crossing a field, and every time he got out of the foxhole, his glasses would frost up. And he said this German soldier jumped up right in front of him. He didn't even see him in the snow with the white suit on. And he says, after that, I never took my glasses off. He was at the Battle of the Bulge for 6 weeks. And after that, they headed east into Germany. And by February 5th was when he got hit. And that was, he said, the whole world just exploded when the mortar hit him, and he was bleeding from the head, the arm, the leg, the shoulder, and the medics picked him up and took him back to a field hospital in Luxembourg City, in Luxembourg, a little tiny country on the north side of France. And he was there 5 days. They stitched him up. They shot him full of penicillin because he had pneumonia and strep throat. And he said, they yanked my tonsils out.
Just for good measure.
And my sergeant, he said, brought me a Purple Heart, which means that it was an award for being wounded, and handed me a new rifle and took me back to my unit in 5 days.
After being wounded, Walter's outlook on the world changed dramatically.
It changed his whole outlook about being clean and warm and having hot food. No one was so grateful for a bowl of hot oatmeal than my husband. He just relished it because they were on the move so much they didn't have time to build campfires and whatever they had to do to warm food.
After being injured and living outside for an entire year, Walter's feelings on life changed dramatically. Walter's daughter Cecilia recalls some of his thoughts on the situation.
One of the parts of Dad's story that was always interesting to hear, but also very difficult to hear, was, the time that he spent outside, in the middle of a forest, fighting the Germans and never going inside. And, for as long as I can remember, he never liked winter for that reason. But it also took him back. He developed a very special relationship, as they all did, with the men in their companies.
After the Battle of the Bulge, there were only 7 men left in his platoon. There should be 30. He saw all those men that he went up with killed or wounded and sent back or buried. And that affected him.
Being so close to his company, Walter was able to discuss his life and the lives of other soldiers after the war.
All his life, wondering what happened to the ones that made it home. One man was in his company that wrote to me after Walter's death that they were in the company. He sent me the picture of their company, and there they are, both of them in the same, which is unusual because we had 16 million men in uniform during World War II. Illinois had 1 million of those, right at 1 million, which appeared to me,
Huge number.
always felt to me like it was more than our share, being one state of 48 at the time.
Out of those 16 million men, Walter was able to find one old friend from high school during the war.
His division was the first to cut Germany in two, so they were really rolling fast across Germany with their tank battalion. But when they got to Walsassen, Germany, he was on guard duty during the night, and when it started to get dawn, here's another soldier laying there. They were laying in a railroad terminal under boxcars, and when dawn came and he could see this man's face, it was somebody named Mike that he'd gone to high school with. That wasn't even in his company, that had gotten lost from his unit and crawled in under there because he could see it was another U.S. soldier there.
Seeing old friends and making new ones couldn't take away from the pains of war.
Just the fact that he had to kill people and throw grenades into basements, hoping that there were no civilians in there, when they would clear out of town.
Walter experienced a strange situation when the Germans surrendered.
The war ended in Czechoslovakia, Klatovy, Czechoslovakia. The Russians held half the town and the Americans the other half. And the 11th German Panzer Division surrendered to his company there. They began the war with 200 tanks, and the day that their general drove up to Walter's captain and said, and it had the German general came up with a white flag wanting to surrender the 11th Panzer Division. And his captain said, there's no general here of your rank. He demanded to surrender only to an officer of the same rank. But there were no generals there, so he had to, the captain just told him to get back in the Jeep and go on to headquarters, and they escorted him back to the command center.
Walter used his faith to help him get through the difficulties of war. Walter was no longer just a boy. He was now a man. He was in Europe for over 2 years.
His faith was Roman Catholic. He was a black Irishman from Chicago, which was Roman Catholic people. And he said the priest would come up in the Jeep, and anybody that wanted to go to Mass that winter that he spent outdoors, the priest would say Mass on the hood of his Jeep. And it made such an impression on him that he made promises that if he could live through this, that he would always be faithful to his church and his Lord. And he kept that promise.
True to the promise, Walter survived the war. After the war, he had occupation duty in Europe.
When the war ended in Europe, then after that he was on occupation duty for a year. providing and giving back water and electricity to all the villages in Germany.
Rebuilding the towns that had been destroyed during the war.
While on occupation duty, Walter arrived in Nuremberg during the Nuremberg war crimes trial.
The German officers and higher-ranking officers that survived the war were brought to trial. There were dozens of them by a whole group of countries. It was called the Nuremberg War Crimes Trial. Many of them were sentenced to life imprisoned, and many of them were hung, especially the ones who ran the death camps, because the atrocities that went on in Germany during the Holocaust are just unbelievable. General Eisenhower made sure that thousands of photographs were taken of the conditions, and the boxcars full of dead bodies piled up that had come or were headed for the crematorium.
Upon finishing occupation duty in Europe, Walter was finally sent home, but not before one more minor mishap.
One story that Dad told, and it was the day he was leaving.
Oh, about the court-martial.
Yeah, the day he got to come home. They're at the port, ready to get on the ship to come home, and was it Mac that handed him the...
Some lieutenant in full dress who had just come said, "Soldier, where's your tie?"
Well, no, he handed him the court-martial.
Well, not until after he violated him for not having a tie. And Walter couldn't imagine where he was going to find a tie, where he'd been, And so the lieutenant handed him a court-martial. So when you're court-martialed, that's bad time. He didn't want any bad time on his record. So he went over to the tent. They handed him the paper. He got on the ship, the USS George Washington, which was exactly 2 years from the time it was 2 years from D-Day. And so when he got on board, his sergeant happened to be from Chicago that was in charge of his unit. And he said, "Sergeant Harris," by that time Walter was a sergeant, "what does this mean?" And he said, "Sergeant, I had no tie when we started to embark." And so the sergeant from Chicago, which was his hometown, wadded it up and threw it out the porthole. He thought that was good, so he didn't have any bad time on his record.
After arriving home, Walter was given little time to recover before returning to everyday life.
They're checking for post-traumatic stress. It may take weeks for them to be released from service. After World War II, with 16 million people coming back, wanting jobs, families, homes, and so forth, they gave you 3 days. And nothing was, and you weren't screened or evaluated. I guess you were given a physical, but Walter got home in 3 days.
While at home, Walter continued to talk and stay in contact with a soldier who he had befriended during the war.
Yes, he had a close friendship for 30 years with a young man from San Francisco named David that he was in boot camp with, in basic training with. He went out to visit him. 10 years later, he took me back to visit with him in San Francisco. And they kept in touch for years and years until his friend died.
Walter became a history teacher through the aid of the GI Bill. Walter was able to attend Bradley University. The GI Bill was passed at the end of World War II to aid returning soldiers in order to prevent another depression like the one that followed World War I. It allowed certain benefits such as paying for soldiers' college education.
But the GI Bill educated millions of returning soldiers who would never have had a chance or the funds.
Mr. and Mrs. Harris met each other in college and eventually married.
I was married to Walter 58 years, and half of our years were here, 40 years of that time. We were right here in this house.
Mrs. Harris was given an opportunity to express her final thoughts.
You think about the history of World War II and what young men like Walter and his people, the soldiers that were with him, endured. So I'm just grateful. I'm grateful to our country that we had men like Walter and like the men who helped build the memorial with him.
First off, we would like to thank Mrs. Harris and her daughter, Mrs. Tumulty, for their contributions of their time and stories for this project. We would also like to honor and thank the brave men like Walter Harris who courageously fought for our country. Without men of such caliber, our country and its freedoms would not be the way it is today. One of the ideas from this project that we found remarkable was the resiliency of the soldiers during and after the war. The soldiers were outside for months, battling not just the Axis forces, but also the brutal elements. The men were constantly moving, yet they still had enough stamina to fight and win grueling battles. The rigor and demands of being a soldier in World War II was something that we, and we suspect many other people, have tended to overlook. Not only did the soldiers have to recover quickly during the war, but in the aftermath of the war, the men were given a simple physical examination before they were expected to return to civilian life. However, psychological examinations were not common. This speaks volumes about the mental strength of these men. Mrs. Harris spoke of how difficult it was for Mr. Harris to do things like throw a grenade into a basement and hope that there were no civilians in the basement. To be able to recover from harsh experiences such as Walter's is yet another testament that these men really were the greatest generation.